Hugo Turner is a writer and a researcher specializing in the history of anti-imperialism. He blogs at anti-imperialist-u.blogspot.com. And you can find him on Twitter at Hugo Turner 1969 and on Facebook as well. I'm excited to have him here to discuss his new article, Sullivan and Cromwell, Capitalism, Intelligence, and Fascism, which appears at libya360.wordpress.com. This is an article about the infamous U.S. corporate law firm that launched the careers of the Dulles brothers. So thanks for coming on today, Hugo.
Thanks for inviting me.
Definitely. So it's common on the left to people talk about corporate power, but it's kind of abstract. So what you've done here is you're focusing on one of the law firms that's kind of so important, the real guiding hands of the corporate power. So tell us how corporate lawyers have affected our history.
Well, Sullivan and Cromwell is the premier Wall Street law firm, and it served even more powerful, which is like the multinational corporations. And before there was a CIA, the corporations had to carry out their own coups. And Sullivan Cromwell was a law firm that you could go to if you wanted that kind of thing done. United Fruit was like another corporation that could carry out coups on its own. So Sullivan Cromwell, I'm interested mainly because, of course, the most influential CIA director, Dulles, worked at Sullivan Cromwell. So did his brother, who became the Secretary of State and was a major Cold War architect, John Foster Dulles. While I was researching it, I discovered that Sullivan Cromwell had created the Panama Canal and launched the coup and done all that stuff that in school you learned that it was Teddy Roosevelt, but this is before Teddy Roosevelt was in office. So if you want to cover like the history of the corporations, the rise of the multinational, like the birth of our world, where like intelligence agencies and these multinational corporations rule the world, there's really nothing ordinary people can do about it. You got to like research the history of Sullivan and Cromwell, because it's just sort of a case study in how things really work.
Yeah, let's start with the beginning of their history. You wrote basically this started from even before the Civil War.
Yes, there's two founders, Algernon Sidney Sullivan, and he before the Civil War he had he was married to one of George Washington's descendants, which brought him into the American aristocracy, and she was like very pro-slavery, pro-South, and his clients were all like Southern businessmen who, when they needed business done in New York, they would use him. So he was actually locked up during the Civil War for defending pirates by the then Secretary of State, William Seward, because he was considered like treacherous for doing this. Basically, like today, we would call them terrorists, basically, because they launched these ships and were just raiding without any, like pretending to be a merchant ship and raiding people, and they were caught.
These are the Southern ships, the Confederate ships, right?
Yeah, this is these Confederate pirates, and he was locked in jail, but he was released right before the thing actually went to trial, and he won the case. But his partner was actually the son of a Union officer. It's kind of like how Sullivan Cromwell always hedges his bets or will play both sides of the fence, or it has a paradoxical side to the way they do things. Like they were the first to hire Jewish lawyers, but then they were also like central in doing business with Nazi Germany. Sullivan was the first one to sponsor a black lawyer and to join the New York bar. So that's just like an example of that. And Cromwell is the one who actually brought the firm into full success. Like Sullivan had this career where it's like ups and downs, and then he gets this young guy, Cromwell was only 25 at the time, to be his partner, and then he died fairly early on. So it was really Cromwell that masterminded the rise of Sullivan and Cromwell by working for people like J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, W. Averill Harriman, Goldman Sachs, etc.
And this is all like after the Civil War.
Yes, Sullivan died in 1877. So after that, it was really Cromwell that was in charge.
Okay. So he's after the Civil War. Cromwell's kind of taking over. How was he running it? You said here he helped J.P. Morgan create U.S. Steel.
Yes, they created. There was this at the time. It was this antitrust legislation. So they created this new thing called a multinational. A new thing called a corporation was actually just to get around this trust thing. And this was U.S. Steel was like a steel trust that remained with, basically the most powerful, or like I think there was two of them, steel companies in the United States. I mean, like JFK went up against U.S. Steel during the 60s before he was killed because they were cheating the people with their monopoly. So and Cromwell basically, and he gave him the idea and he did all like the legal work. That was kind of like what he would do is they would have states that would try to pass regulations. So they would create these corporations, would disband and create a new corporation in the state that didn't have those regulations because Cromwell had already like got the people to pass like the laws that would make it a corporate haven. Places like New Jersey, they still have this thing where the reason all those Wall Street firms don't pay taxes is because they're like a lot of them are incorporated in New Jersey, where like they passed these laws that they wouldn't have to barely pay any taxes and they could do whatever they wanted. So as a servant to corporate power, he rose and Sullivan and Cromwell became the top Wall Street law firm. Sullivan and Cromwell, like most corporate law firms, was divided to associates and partners. It would hire the top graduates from law schools, and then they would work. They would exploit these associates because they would hope to be partnered. They would just like work all the long hours and do all like the grunt work. They kept expanding the number of the associates. Some of them would die of overwork. There was like a strange loyalty because people liked to work for Sullivan and Cromwell because at least they got to immediately start doing like important work because they were being exploited, kind of. So and Cromwell institutionalized this loyalty by creating the Sullivan and Cromwell Society, which had a yearly dinner where every former associate would come back there and work there. And Sullivan and Cromwell was not, I mean, people that didn't make partners would go on to like different influential positions in the corporate world. It was one of the strangest things is they even maintained close relations with people that were rejected, which included Richard Nixon. And he thanked them for not hiring when he was the vice president because he was like, if you'd hired me, I'd be a corporate lawyer today. But thanks to you, I'm the vice president. But ironically, he would lose his election for presidency, and so he would go back to being a corporate lawyer before actually becoming the president in 1968. And Nixon was widely regarded as a dullest mouthpiece while he was in Congress, according to Peter Dale Scott. And they worked closely together during the Eisenhower administration when Nixon was the vice president. He played an important. He was in all the secret operations, the CIA stuff. Although Eisenhower was also very into it, despite he tried to create this image of himself as kind of like hands off, and he was like the nice guy, and like the dullest ones were to blame. But historians increasingly see Eisenhower as totally to blame in on all of it. But Nixon was also in on all of it.
Interesting. So it was almost like a club, even for it was just almost.
It was literally a club
because
every year they would have this big dinner. All the former associates would attend this thing, and they would have skits and stuff. It was like a yearly event. It was called the Sullivan and Cromwell Society. So it's like would be out of the law firm. Cromwell created that.
Oh, it's almost like with the skits and stuff. It reminds me of the Bohemian Grove or something like that. They do similar things.
It's like a kind of it's sort of like it's sort of similar to those other kind of more infamous conspiracy networks, where it's just sort of like everyone that's worked there, even people that didn't work there, like Nixon, had this kind of Sullivan and Cromwell network, and Sullivan and Cromwell, the partners, sat on boards of directors of their client companies. So like John Foster Dulles was on like 15 boards of directors, for one example. So like all these different American corporations had Sullivan and Cromwell people there, and so it's sort of like the Sullivan and Cromwell network. Not that it's like all controlling everything behind the scenes. It's just like it's one of the many networks that they created. Like the Dulles brothers also created like the Council on Foreign Relations, and many of these they were there at the birth of using these NGOs and think tanks as tools of American imperialism and CIA covert operations.
No, that's fascinating. I never knew it was. I mean, it goes far beyond just being a little law firm or even just a corporation. It's a whole different kind of thing.
Yes.
So go into this. Into this part about the Panama Canal.
Yes. Cromwell's greatest triumph was the creation of the Panama Canal and the creation of the country of Panama, because back then it was part of Colombia. And then when Colombia wouldn't give him the deal he wanted, he'd also set up this railroad down there. And he used those employees to like launch a coup, and then all the railroad employees became the people in the government, and they came to New York to like get this huge thing of cash to like bribe to pay off all their supporters. So Cromwell created Panama. He created the Panama Canal. He was working for this French company that had built the Suez Canal, but then went bankrupt building the Panama Canal. I guess like 15,000 poor black workers had died during the French project. that part was like left out. And they found it out recently. Basically, almost like slave labor conditions. And Cromwell also had to. I guess America had always planned to build a canal through Nicaragua, and especially the Southern senators had always favored this thing because they wanted to be able to ship the products of their stuff to California, I guess, cheap. And so he had to go up against the powerful Nicaragua canal lobby. And just by like getting close to William McKinley through his right-hand man, Mark Hanna, by bribing various congressmen, he hired journalist Roger Farnham to set up a PR firm. Farnham would go on to be the vice president of National Citibank, which is Citibank today, and the president of the Haiti Railroad. Citibank has been involved with like so much crazy bad stuff over the years, like during the Iran-Contra era and long before that. Anyways, Cromwell caused riots in Paris when he like masterminded the scheme where like his big investors would get paid back and the small investors would get like barely anything, which is what happens over and over again every time things crash or whatever. It's always like people that invest their savings in there that gets wiped out, and like big corporations always get their money back. And Sullivan and Cromwell always managed to break things that way. They've done it again and again. It's like when you read this book, it's like every time, history repeats itself. And the same people that Sullivan and Cromwell were defending back 100 years ago are the same people that like screwed everybody over during the crash of 2008. This stuff is still going on. I mean, Sullivan and Cromwell is still the most powerful corporate law firm.
They still exist today, right? I mean,
yes, absolutely.
While working on the Panama Canal, this is the time period where this looks like John Foster Dulles' father or grandfather? Grandfather.
Yeah, he hired John Foster Dulles' grandfather, John Foster, who had worked for Sullivan back in Ohio in 1855 during the Panama Canal deal. And then later, it was John Foster asked Cromwell for a favor to hire his son, John Foster Dulles, after he got rejected at the law firm. And so he did hire him. And then John Foster Dulles sort of took over as the most important figure after Cromwell. And his era was the era where Sullivan and Cromwell became involved with engineering these huge investments in Germany for the American corporations, because they came out of World War One very well, and they also were reaping these huge profits from like Wilson's imperialist moves. Like he invaded all these countries in Latin America before entering World War One, a part they usually leave out of the history books. He entered only at the very end, so America suffered the least and was like the most powerful, and sort of like it was a smaller version of what happened after World War II, where this is when America really came onto the international scene, was finally able to compete with the French and British because they owed them all this money for what they'd spent during World War One, and the whole thing. But they were broke and they couldn't pay, and they also were demanding these huge reparations from Germany. So John Foster Dulles made his fame by serving on the reparations committee and signing this deal where America would loan Germany the money to pay back France and Britain, and then that would keep the financial merry-go-round of the world going during the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, until it all crashed and Hitler came into power. But then John Foster Dulles, the next thing he did was he helped all the American corporations invested and build up Nazi Germany as a bulwark against Soviet Russia, which is what, of course, all these corporations feared most was communism, not Hitler. And so that's what a lot of my article deals with.
Right.
He worked with I.G. Farben. He worked with Hjalmar Schacht.
This was, I guess, in Weimar, Germany, right? So
It started immediately after World War One, and they were already thinking about how they had to build Germany up against the Soviet Union and the threat of communism, because Germany had had a failed revolution that was finally put down. Hungary had had a revolution that they put down. That was Alan Dulles. Like, he was the one who was like, "You've got to start backing the fascist dictator Horthy," which they did, and then waging a covert war on the infant Soviet Russia, which they lost. So yeah, it's this post-World War One period when like the Dulles brothers really come on the world stage. But John Foster Dulles had always his grandfather had been Secretary of State. Their uncle was the future Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, and so when he became Secretary of State during World War One, and he appointed them out of these Versailles commissions, and they were also John Foster Dulles had also President Wilson had been his favorite professor at college. And they actually had more influence with Wilson because their uncle Robert Lansing had told Wilson, like, let me handle these Versailles things. You don't have to go to Europe. And Wilson was just mortally offended by that. So even though they only got to go there because of their uncle, they were actually closer to the president than their uncle because they had this relationship because John Foster Dulles had gone to Princeton while Woodrow Wilson was the president of that university.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He was his favorite professor.
Huh.
And Alan Dulles' suggestion to back the fascist Hungary, like, even though he's supposedly like a low-level person, Wilson's like, yes, we got to do this.
And now they were not involved with the law firm at this point, or they were?
John Foster Dulles already was. Alan Dulles was at the State Department and then would join the law firm in the 20s, 1925, I think.
Okay. So it's still kind of the revolving door thing we have today, like in the corporation to the government.
Yeah, John Foster Dulles joined it before. Yeah, he joined it before World War One. He engineered the U.S. occupation of Cuba as a favor from his uncle, who was then the secretary. Was I think it's the Department of Navy or the secretary, undersecretary of defense or something. I mean, not defense, but war. So he was doing like, Sullivan Cromwell, like strong-arming Latin American governments, engineering coups and stuff like that before World War One started. And then during World War One, he served on the War Trade Board. But even though Alan Dulles wasn't at Sullivan Cromwell, because they were brothers and because, it's like this network, Alan Dulles was sort of like his eyes and ears and report on what was going on using his State Department connections. And he was also really a spy. Like, even though he was supposedly in the State Department during this World War One period, actually he was already doing intelligence work. And actually Alan Dulles during the war was stationed in Bern, the same place he would be stationed during World War II, from which he would be doing all this treacherous stuff with German businessmen, what he called the good Germans, and doing the secret deal with the Nazi SS Führer guy, Karl Wolff.
Right, but then that hasn't changed, right? Because you showed earlier how they were working with the Confederacy, and now they're...
Yeah, they would go in and out. Yeah, they would go into it's the corporate governmental revolving door where they'd go into the government, then back to Sullivan Cromwell, and back to the government many times.
Yeah, stuff.
And they would also work at the same time for the government and the corporation, basically.
Oh, did they do that as well, really?
Yeah, where it would just be, like, John Foster Dulles would be called in as legal counsel to these different big conferences, even though he was still working at Sullivan and Cromwell.
So what were some of the deals that they had? Like, when you say that they were working with, like, IG Farben and stuff, was it just a matter of investing in these German companies to help them grow? Like, what was that? We always hear about IBM.
It was like a marriage of the interlocking corporate elite of the United States with the interlocking corporate elite of Germany, where Ford, GM, ITT, Standard Oil in New Jersey, and IG Farben, AEG, and Veronica Stahlworks became like closely interlinked, where these German figures would serve on like the board of like Ford Germany or something. The American people would be like owning huge, like GE owned 30% of the German steel electricity trust, AEG. So it was just sort of like an interlocking, incestuous relationship that built up before and after Hitler came to power.
So they actually shared like ownership of these companies. It wasn't just...
In some cases, yes. And in other cases, it was German companies trying to buy into specific American cartels, like the nickel cartel, and to get strategic minerals that during the war they would use to like supply themselves. And also they come to these patent agreements that would prevent the United States from producing technologies because German corporations had patents on it. And strangely, even though it's supposedly we're in total war, they have to respect these. The laws of the multinational corporations apparently even trump the needs and necessities of a country at war, because they allow these German patents to like halt vital materials that America needed. And John Foster Dulles he did the legal work for a lot of that.
Yeah, that's what's so strange. The book
or not so
goes into
strange.
that stuff.
Yes, it's not so strange, because really it's like, of course, capitalism creates fascism when it's worried that communism might take over. So it's sort of like an extreme measure. And they knowingly were supporting fascism, not just in Germany, but in Italy and Japan and all these little teeny countries that people have forgotten were fascist.
Right.
Like Poland.
Right.
And then when you add in the element of like these huge profits and the need for America to invest all the money it was making overseas to keep, like, that's how capitalism works. Like the money has to keep flowing, and when it gets, Christopher Simpson did call it sort of like a financial constipation where it gets stuck in one place. So you have, the key is always to like engineer these scams to keep the money flowing, and Germany was like central in that the whole economic history of the 1920s and 30s. It was the biggest growth of American investments was in Germany, and like all the major household names today were in business with Hitler, like Ford, GM, ITT, which became AT&T, Standard Oil New Jersey, which is owned by like the Rockefellers, and like they owned all the Standard Oil people. Like they split up the Standard Oil monopoly, but then they just created these other teeny companies, and those are the ones that later changed their names to like the oil companies we know today.
Was there any specifics in the books about like some of the products that they couldn't make, or some of the products that were going to Germany from the United States during the war and things like that?
Like for one example is like a process to turn coal into oil, which only Germany had the patent for, and like an American corporation actually sent it to them because they things like that. People could check out this great Dave Emery thing called Uncle Sam and the Swastika, and it will just go into like huge detail about this patent thing, but I don't remember all like the specific details off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, that's a really good.
It's different types of things, like a thing you need for, it's like a plane part or something, or like just like a simple thing like that, or a process for rubber. And all that kind of stuff could seriously affect the war effort when they're not allowed to use it.
Right.
And congressional investigators found that this creation of production bottlenecks to enforcing patent laws had done more damage than like 100 saboteurs could have done, because instead of blowing up factories, it kept them from being built in the first place.
Right. And now there was some like attempt to crack down on it during the war, right? I mean, there was.
Yes.
Eventually, like late in the war, was there not?
There's these two competing factions in the U.S. You have the FDR faction, or especially like the people to the left of him, like Henry Morgenthau. They wanted to crack down on all these people, lock them in jail, etc. And then, of course, there was the Dulles faction, which was the ones that would have been locked in jail. So obviously, they took the opposite approach. They supported Hitler. They thought FDR was like a commie, and they were basically completely, like, during the war, John Foster Dulles was completely pro-German during the whole thing, and he just sort of disguised it under, he became a spokesman for the Federal Council of Churches on the 6 Pillars of Peace. And he was like, we have to get rid of the idea of demonizing certain leaders, like, and by that he meant Hitler, Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito. But then after the war, he became the prime person who created like the demonic view of the Soviet Union, where everything they did was sinister and evil. Like if they wanted peace, it's just a trick, like a dastardly thing to like get you to drop your guard if they're aggressive. Response to America being aggressive, it's like they clearly want to conquer the world.
Right.
So basically, yes, they were traitors out, and they would have been. Some people think. I think really FDR, he was kind of more pragmatic, so there's really no telling what he would have done, or if he would have prevented the Cold War, if he would actually lock these people up. But he told like his friends that he would do it, so like they believed it. But after as soon as before the war ended, FDR died, Truman came in, and the anti-Soviet Dulles faction completely won over, because FDR was really, everyone at the State Department supported the Dulles faction, and like the only reason he could get some people to like do what he said while he was alive, but as soon as he was dead, it was sort of like, of course they're going to rebuild Germany and not punish them. And the pro-German faction that was like more league with corporate America totally took over the American foreign policy. They never let go since.
Right.
Yeah, hence the Cold War.
Right. Well, before we get into some of that stuff, talk a little bit more about the animosity between John Foster Dulles and FDR. And did the Dulles faction have anything to do with that, with the business plot in 1934?
I specifically find that they did, but it was their friends that were involved in it, so I would not be at all surprised if they did know about it. Because it was like they had worked for J.P. Morgan off and on for many years. And like the DuPonts were another like super pro-German American corporation that they didn't work for, but I'm sure he probably supported the coup against FDR if he was in on it. So did General MacArthur.
Right.
He was like another coup candidate, but fortunately they went to Smedley Butler, and he, although he was like kind of a right winger, that was going way too far for him, and he exposed it. But the corporate backers never got punished.
Right. Well, you do have one big section in here about the voluntary Aryanization. I guess this is more about how the Germans kind of the Nazis took over the German economy, right?
Yes, after the Nazis took over, Hitler passed these laws that you couldn't take money out of Germany. You had to reinvest your profits. Like if you were, like I say, Ford, you had to reinvest your profits in Germany. And so, like, there's two main things you could invest in. One was illegal armaments. The other one was this voluntary Aryanization, in quotes, because it wasn't actually voluntary, but just on the surface before they later they moved to involuntary. But in the beginning was this voluntary Aryanization where basically German firms would buy up Jewish-owned businesses for pennies on the dollar. They would buy it using bonds floated on the international market by people like the Dillon Reed Investment Bank, which is important as Sullivan and Cromwell in like the history of influential people that came out of Dillon Reed that later became foreign policy planners. It's like 8 people, including like the 3 main ones: William Draper, James Forrestal, and Paul Nitze. But during the 30s, and William Draper was especially involved in this voluntary organization. So basically, because you can buy a business for less than it's actually worth, that generates huge profits for whoever. It was big business, basically. It's kind of like the 80s with hostile takeovers, but then you add this extra element where behind the scenes you have the Gestapo pressuring the company to sell at like a super low price. Because they would like literally lock the owners up in jail and beat them up and be like, do you want to get sent to the death camp or do you want to sell off your company? And so that was like $1 billion business as like the German owners took over all the Jewish owned businesses in Germany. And then after the war began, that process was expanded out all over Europe where they just like looted all of, not just Jewish businesses, but especially Jewish businesses all over the areas that they occupied.
And American companies.
And it was American investors they would put these German bonds on the market, and that's where the money was actually going, was for these Aryanization deals. And it was like Americans like William Draper and John Foster Dulles was involved in doing the legal work for a lot of these bonds that were the ones giving them the pennies to buy the company.
You have something here after the war. The Dulles brothers made sure nobody was punished.
Yes, and that's another theme of Christopher Simpson's classic, The Split Odd Beast. Is like it's the story of 2 times the Dulles brothers swooped in to avoid Germany having to pay for its crimes. But like really in World War One, their crimes were very minor and really they were more it was very equal in like what they were doing versus what the Allies were doing, because they lost. They had to pay for all the damage they caused, basically. But after World War II, the Germans had committed this massive genocide. They'd killed like possibly up to like 50 million people. And the Dulles brothers again moved in to save the corporations that had backed Hitler and to save the SS war criminals and to save all of the different fascist death squads that they had, like, for example, the Ukrainians who are in the news today, whatever. That was when they were, I think like 20,000 of them or more were like smuggled out, settled in Canada, America, Argentina, Australia, places all over the world. So there's that element. And then there's like the list of all the German companies that he was in business with before the war. He made sure that they had made huge profits off of slave labor, and because they didn't have to feed their workers and they would just die, and the SS would send in more slaves. So that was hugely profitable. The Japanese were also big into that, and they made sure that all those German companies, that it was covered up what they had done during the war, that they were all good Germans and really deep in their hearts they had opposed Hitler, but they unfortunately, made huge sums of money off slavery and genocide, but they were still the good Germans, because the only bad Germans in their minds was, communist people opposed to Hitler.
Right. Was there similar things going on with the Japanese, or no?
Absolutely. And I wrote an article earlier this year based on the book Gold Warriors by the Seagraves, the husband and wife writers, this Peggy and Sterling Seagrave. And that was like a similar story where the Japanese had like looted all this gold and made these huge fortunes off slave labor that America swooped in and like told the world that like they were totally bankrupt after the war for like a sizable cut that the CIA used to finance its covert operations, just like they seized a certain amount of the Nazi gold and then let them keep a lot of the rest of it. And that is really the reason why Germany and Japan were able to like rise back up to becoming these huge economic superpowers that they were by like the 1980s. Was because of this. Like they were allowed to keep their loot hidden and they used it to rebuild their industries. So they was even competing with America. And Sullivan and Cromwell actually was, to take it full circle, Sullivan and Cromwell actually did the legal work for these huge Japanese corporations that are now household words in the 70s to bring them on the world stage for the 80s, like Sony, people like that.
Okay. Well, let's turn to the the after war period. It always seemed to me that the CIA was just sort of basically straight created out of Sullivan and Cromwell to some extent. How did the CIA get formed?
Well, it wasn't just the other ones. I would say is Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, which is Frank Wisner's law firm, and Donovan Leisure, which was OSS founder William Donovan's law firm. But yes, Alan Dulles. I think if anyone is like the godfather of the CIA, the architect, like the spirit, like kind of like an almost evil specter hounding American history, it is Alan Dulles, and he came from Sullivan and Cromwell, and he created the CIA after the war. Like Truman, he disbanded the OSS because he realized that like was what they did, which was psychological warfare, controlling the media, waging these secret operations to destabilize things. He realized that would completely destroy American democracy, so he resisted creating it, but he only could resist. Like after 1 year, they had to create the CIG, and then the next year they created the CIA in 1947. And Alan Dulles was the one behind the scenes writing the reports that would designing the CIA. First, there's this Jackson and Correa report, which Fletcher Prouty talks about in his book, The Secret Team. And then he helped draft the National Security Act, which was what Congress passed in 1947, which basically created this government of complete secrecy where nobody knows what's actually going on. And ever since then, we've lived in this CIA-controlled America, basically, especially after they killed JFK in 1963.
Right.
And the CIA took over the role that Sullivan and Cromwell used to play, or the United Fruit Company used to do it on its own. And so now you have this one agency that carries out coups on behalf of corporate America all over the world.
Right, built right into the government.
Yeah. Whether a country is a friend or an enemy, the CIA is in there. They're getting people to become loyal to the CIA, not their own governments. And if they're an enemy, then they're trying to cause civil wars and destabilization campaigns, carrying out false flag terror attacks, etc.
Right. So the OPC and the CIA, these were two different organizations, and then
initially, yes. Because Truman was paranoid about the CIA, it was initially just publicly supposed to be, an intelligence analysis and one central place for intelligence to be gathered and analyzed, not a covert action thing, which what Alan Dulles didn't really care about intelligence, he cared about covert action. And so before the CIA really got hardcore into it, although it wasn't involved in all this stuff, they created the OPC, which was part of the State Department, and that was run by Frank Wisner, who was also a corporate lawyer from Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. And he was sort of like the Alan Dulles' right-hand man through this period of the CIA. And but the OPC was later, they brought it into the CIA because of this murder where an American I forget the exact details, but basically the OPC assassinated another American intelligence, a military intelligence type person, because they were onto the heroin trafficking that was going on in Southeast Asia, and then that created this scandal. So all of the details weren't public, but Peter Dale Scott talks about it. But basically, that's when the OPC was brought into the CIA. It became the Office of Plans, or sometimes called the Office of Operations, the DDO or the DDP, and Dulles put Frank Wisner in that role once he was the head of the CIA, until Frank Wisner went crazy. But before that, Dulles had been the director of operations of the CIA after he managed to get in there, but before Eisenhower came in and became director. So yeah, the OPC was kind of like the proto-CIA, and this OPC is the one that people really should look into because it's all the dirtiest stuff that America was up to back then, like the deals with like organizing these Nazis to wage covert war on the Soviet Union and like in Ukraine, and the drug stuff in Asia. That was all like the OPC was involved in all that stuff. And also the control of the media. Like Frank Wisner was in charge of that. They called it the mighty Wurlitzer.
Right. That stuff is basically set up under Truman, but Truman is a little hesitant and he's kind of distrustful of the Dulles brothers. So Eisenhower comes in along in 52 and basically gives the Dulles brothers their positions in the government. So how does that get going?
Yeah, Truman appointed a series of generals. Like Sidney Stewart, I think, was the head of the CIG. Like Vandenberg, and then Walter Bedell Smith was like the director that like hung around for a while. But then once Eisenhower came in, Dulles got to get his dream of finally becoming the director of the CIA. And I guess Henry Luce wanted to become the director of the CIA.
Oh, really?
Who was this another OSS guy who ran the Time Life empire.
Yeah.
And if we're talking about the origin of the CIA, we should talk about the origin of the American media, which is another book that Christopher Simpson talked about, where basically all the heads of these major media corporations were all OSS, former psychological warfare experts. And that's like a vital element of Cold War history that people forget, is like, that's why you shouldn't trust the media, because it's basically they're waging psychological warfare on you to get you to support America's foreign policy and turning the world on its head, where like you think America's just trying to defend itself and that, you know, aggressors are coming at it from everywhere, but really it's America that was the aggressor during the Cold War, and the Soviets were just scared.
And this is C.D. Jackson and Henry Luce.
Yeah, C.D. Jackson, Henry Luce, people like that. Arthur Bliss Lane at Reader's Digest, he's another important one. And they also sat on these secret committees of like Operation Bloodstone, which was this bringing all these fascists into the American intelligentsia and putting them in all these universities and putting them in the media and putting them in foreign policy planning. It should be it should be more famous than Operation Paperclip, but I think I've only read Christopher Simpson talking about it. And Arthur Bliss Lane was, and a lot of these guys were on that. So it's kind of like there's only 200 of these international people with experience in international business that work for these multinational corporations, and they made up the American foreign policy elite. And they all know each other. And a lot of them, the sons of the rich, joined the intelligence agencies during the war so they don't get killed. So all these media empires were controlled by the OSS, basically, former OSS. Al Dulles could just call up any newspaper in the country and just be like, fire this guy here, he's talking too much about what's going on in Guatemala, about how our brand is good, or fire this guy here in Japan, he's like revealing too much about what MacArthur's up to, or the CIA behind the scenes is controlling the media.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, you want to talk about a little bit about what happened in Guatemala and Iran? I mean, I know most people know about the coups, but what was Sullivan Cromwell's role specifically in those events?
Once Eisenhower came into power, he appointed John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State, because after the war, John Foster Dulles had made himself as the top GOP foreign policy expert. So while he was there for like the birth of the UN to like ruin that. And so the Russians call him like one of the worst imperialists. It's never that. He actually took that as a point of pride and bragged about it, and was always like this. The Soviets tried to expose all the Dulles brothers' business ties to the Nazis, and so and after that, no American journalist could say anything about it, because then the Dulles brothers would be like, "You're towing the Moscow line." Just sort of like today, how they try to do it, but calling things Russian propaganda, like, oh, there's Nazis in Ukraine. Well, that's just Russian propaganda.
Right.
Or you must be a Russian propagandist if you say this. And so, you have the brother who's like the head of the Secretary of State, and you have Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, and those two agencies always have this kind of like brotherly relationship. With like we were saying earlier, the State Department is actually running an even worse thing than like the early CIA, the Office of Policy Coordination under Frank Wisner. So now they're working in perfect harmony, just like they always are, where like you don't know whether someone in the State Department is actually at the State Department or whether they're the CIA. I grew up around DC, and that was always a joke. Like anyone in the State Department, it's like people are like, "Oh, are you in the CIA?" And so, anyways, that that relationship, that close relationship between the CIA and the State Department was never more close than during the Dulles, when two brothers were in charge of both, and they could just decide things with private meetings with Eisenhower and them. A lot of the history was completely off the record. It's like completely lost because it's just like they just meet up for drinks and plan their next moves.
Right.
Even though they were no longer at Sullivan and Cromwell officially, they were still carrying out the business of Sullivan and Cromwell because the coups that they carried out were actually on behalf of Sullivan and Cromwell clients, like Anglo-American Oil, which later changed its name to BP, which it signed this agreement when Iran was basically a colony of Britain. It had gotten like whatever the emperor in charge at the time was to sign this deal where Britain would get free access to all Iranian oil and only have to pay on like a pittance. And after World War II, like nationalism was on the rise because the European powers had been like beaten and they owed all this money and they lost all this property. They no longer had the financial wherewithal to like keep their colonies firm. So this is the era where all the colonies were gaining new independence all over the world, and they were like inspiring each other. And Iran was one of those countries. They had Mossadegh, who rose up on this issue before he even came to power. He had the Iranian parliament vote whether, before he would accept power, he had to vote that they would all nationalize the oil company, and so Iran's oil would go to benefit Iran, not Anglo-American Oil, today British Petroleum. And even though Truman opposed like a coup, Alan Dulles was working on that when Truman was still in power with the British, and then exchange. And so then once Eisenhower came in, he's like, yes, go for this coup. They falsely claimed that Mossadegh was a communist because he would not outlaw the Communist Party, and that was a major element of American foreign policy at the time, which was that to be declared democratic, you had to ban communists from the government, and
right,
even if they were popular. So the votes, even if like say communists could win like a certain number of votes, they shouldn't be allowed to serve. And a lot of people like they were themselves communists, but they're like, no. I mean, especially since the communists were siding with Mossadegh, he's like, no, I'm not going to ban them from power. And so they were like, Reds are about to take over Iran, even though Mossadegh had worked with America to force the Soviets to leave northern Iran because they'd been able, during the war, they'd been allowed to occupy northern Iran to make sure that the oil supplies wouldn't be cut off by the British. And then after the war, they're like, get out of here as soon as possible, like, creating a hysteria that as if, they're about to take over the whole country. And so then they got them to withdraw. And then, but then they forced Mossadegh out too, like a few years later. And basically, this was like, it wasn't really the first, they were already interfered in Italy. And that was when like Al Dulles wasn't even at the CIA, but he was working behind the scenes with the Office of Policy Coordination. And he was working, at one point he went around to all these different corporate heads and got them to like give them like millions of dollars to like rig the Italian election in 1948. And then Iran was the big example where they set up these, they waged psychological warfare. They carried out false flag terror attacks where they had people pretend to be communists who would attack religious leaders, and then the religious leaders would denounce the communists, and then they bribed this military guy to like side with the Shah against Mossadegh. And eventually, after like one failed coup attempt, they had a successful coup attempt. It was managed by Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt. So Mossadegh was thrown out, the Shah was brought in, the CIA and Israel helped him train like this brutal internal secret police, the Savak, which would use all these horrible methods of torture to keep people in line, until eventually, like in 1979, he got, or I guess it was probably his son, got overthrown. That was all on behalf of Anglo-Iranian Oil, which was a Sullivan Cromwell.
Oh, that was a client of theirs.
And then the coup in Guatemala was also a Sullivan Cromwell client, and United Fruit, which Alan Dulles had also served on the board of directors on, and his Christopher Simpson was like, United Fruit was a pace setter in finding ways to do illegal business with Germany against the attempts of the American and British governments to regulate it or whatever. But that was like what Alan Dulles' specialties. That's why corporate law, that's what they have in common with the CIA, is that they set up these fronts and these things all over the world and move money in secret. And
well, it's funny, they always accuse communism of being internationalist and being conspiratorial, but that is exactly what they are doing there. They have no regard for their own national government, and they are operating in total secret.
Well, of course, the KGB was an intelligence agency. Like when it came to spying, they were actually better than the Americans. But they never mounted these coups all over the world. So when people claim it's like equal sides, it's like, no, it never happened. There was never like, They just claimed that they were. Like whenever a nationalist would take power, they're like, no, they're secretly controlled by the Kremlin. We don't need proof. We know just because if their goals are in line with the Kremlin, then they would just say that they were Kremlin stooges just because they wanted to like nationalize their things, which is, that was why on the spectrum of communism. So whether they were nationalists or communists, they opposed them. Whether they were like communists that were independent of like their sponsors, like Vietnam, they opposed them.
Exactly.
They claimed that
Vietnam's a perfect example.
They tried to claim that the Sino-Soviet split was just a big fake. Like I was saying earlier, it's like Michael Prenti does this great routine about it, where it's just like you interpret everything that the Soviet Union does as bad, whether it's like aggressive or peaceful, whether it's like does nothing at all. They're just trying to lull you in a false sense of security to decide a disarmament deal. They're just trying to like set you up so it can secretly have an advantage.
Well, it's the same thing with like the fracking thing here. It's like that has even become Vladimir Putin thing because people don't want,
Well, that's why they're bringing it back, because it's so useful to just be like, oh, of course, everybody that is opposed to the war in Syria is just a Russian agent. Everybody that is exposing what we're doing in Ukraine is a Russian agent. Black Lives Matter protesters, they're just Russian agents. Like everything is just a Russian thing to divide our like perfect democracy, which is a joke because the average people don't actually want all these wars. They just ignore them. Average people don't want corporations to like get super rich while the rest of us are super poor, but they just ignore them. So it's not really a democracy when you only can vote for two parties that are they both support capitalism and they both support war. Just one is more openly racist than the other.
Yeah, well, that's basically all it's come down to.
So they have to create this second Cold War, basically, which is why I was actually studying this. I'm studying the origins of the first Cold War.
Yeah, but they're so studying one, you get such a great idea of what's really happening, because at least when you study the old one, a lot of it has sort of come out, but now then you can look at the new one and see all the lies, basically, because it's just, you can see the same things they're talking about today that they used to try to pass off back then, but now we know is, all total bullshit. But so what's going on today with Sullivan and Cromwell? You've got your last part of your article, a little bit about Peter Thiel and some of what's going on today.
Oh yes, Peter Thiel, who works closely with the CIA venture capital firm InQtel and was one of the primary funders of the foundation of Facebook, started at Sullivan and Cromwell. So they're still apparently involved in both like corporate power, and apparently people that go on to be involved with the CIA still come out of Sullivan and Cromwell. But my book only went up to the 80s. They were like, people have seen the movie Wall Street, like Sullivan and Cromwell of that era would fit perfectly into that movie. Like they're all about defending and launching hostile takeovers, basically.
Well, it's really a great article, and it's such an important topic, and it's really good. People definitely should read it, and it's got so much detail that we couldn't talk about here. But yeah, it's cool. Do you want to add anything else?
Oh, I definitely want to add this quote from John Foster Dulles, which sums up his whole attitude. First, there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those who are Christians and support free enterprise, and then there are the others.
That basically sums up their propaganda, I think, perfectly, and I think we see it today, right?
Absolutely. With the media, the control of the media is like 10 times worse now because it's just a complete monopoly of 7 corporations. Where at least back then there were like all these hundreds of media things they had to control. Now it's just all totally centralized.
Oh, it's horrible.
dealing out propaganda, like especially 24 hours a day.
Well, I mean, even when you do study like the JFK assassination and you study the early news reports, at least there were all of these local newspapers, and hundreds of each city had their own newspaper and was sending reporters out. And we know the press still had the CIA was doing a lot at the big broadcasting networks, but there was still ways for, serious professionals who were getting paid to go and find new information and get it out one way. And now it's just, except for people on the internet who don't have, we can say whatever we want, but we're not getting paid to do it.
But they're shutting that down now.
Well, and that's true too.
Exactly. We don't have any resources.
Yeah.
And they're like making it so that people can't spread that kind of information. Like I can still post my blog, but now since they start censoring it,
yeah,
everybody's numbers are down in the alternative media. And now like YouTube is actively trying to promote like the mainstream media. It's like, oh, wouldn't you like to watch this thing for ABC News? Like, is that what YouTube is for, really?
Yeah.
No. If I want to watch that, I just turn on the TV.
Exactly. And now they're even offering, I mean, I get a pop-up on my thing that's like, oh, now watch 60 plus channels of things, just so now they want people to go back to like, plop down on the sofa and pick between 60 bullshit channels instead of, get lost in all kinds of amazing stuff that you were totally interested in. Now it's just go back to being a couch potato kind of thing.
Yeah. Really, it's like people don't want to know. People don't. The problem is the average people, they don't want to know. It's like, they'll tell them this. It's like, you get this blank stare. It's like, I don't want to hear about bad things that America's doing. Like, what? Like, or like, why would you study that? Like, what? I don't care about, like, they'll be like, oh, I just don't have time to.
Totally. But eventually, I just feel like the world comes and, and slams your head against the wall when people aren't paying enough attention. I think that's what's happening now with all this stuff,
Well, that's the main difference between this Cold War and the first one is the first one started right after they've had all the New Deal. This one is starting after they've cut all that out and they've destroyed the social safety net. It's like the whole economy is like on the verge of collapse. And it's just like in 20 years, and they're going to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons. And it's like there's no healthcare. It's like in 20 years, it's our country is going to look like a third world country. It already does. It already is a third world country basically now. But I think it'll be way worse in 20 years if they just keep spending everything on the military and nothing on the populace. And they keep just like letting these multinational corporations run wild and no matter, they steal billions of dollars. Of course, you can't send them to prison. That would be inhumane. If someone steals a candy bar, some cop could like shoot in the back and like there'll be like a million right wingers saying how he had it coming.
Yep. That's the state of things.
This is Our Hidden History